Welcome. Welcome if you're returning after listening to the first episode of the podcast, but also welcome to anyone new as well. As you were able to tell from the title and description of this episode, I'll be talking about the themes of reality, reason, responsibility through the lens of today's modern and postmodern society. But I highly recommend you follow up on this episode by listening to the audio essay that I've uploaded on Spotify. It breaks down a lot of the themes that I discussed today and puts them in a more stylistic way. Also, I wouldn't know given the stats on my first episode, but I've been told it's helpful if I ask those on YouTube to subscribe and like. So I'd greatly appreciate if you could do that. It would be remiss of me, even if it serves as nothing more than a disclaimer, not to mention the hesitancy I've been caught in deciding whether to release this episode or not. In many ways, it pushes back against the mannerisms taught me by my parents growing up. You have two ears and one mouth, use them accordingly, was one of those lessons. And actually, to those who have known me better than most, they'll likely know me as a fairly reserved personality. But today, not only me, one is confronted with a horde of ideas as well as people, of such crushing tenacity that to stay silent would itself be a lie, and worse more, a sort of subjugation to a pygmy existence. A short while ago, I heard a piece of advice that's come to define my approach to pretty much every one of the genuinely difficult decisions I've had to make, and I continue to make, in the day-to-day running of my startup, but also personal decisions on when and what to say. Generally speaking, decisions built on the premise of principle. It's from Christopher Hitchens, whom many of you will know, a man who, if nothing else, most will agree, lived a life with zest and purpose, if not too much wine and whiskey. But he said, you choose your future regret. It's also something I've heard Douglas Murray, the British author, discuss before. And so when I'm confronted with a decision, for example, deciding what to say in this podcast episode and whether to release it, I ask myself, which regret will I be able to bear more? Which regrets would I just not be able to bear? Because in the nature of making a decision between a certain number of options, there will always be regrets. You will never know what will have happened should you have picked and pursued a different course of action. And so I ask myself, which one of these possible regrets will I simply not be able to bear? And for me, the things that usually follow are, I feel I have to speak up and speak my mind if I've got something I deem worth saying, because I couldn't bear not to say it. Or I have to adhere to the truth, no matter how hard it is, because I couldn't bear living with the lie, or bending the reality not only of myself, but of another person. Or I can only publicly, for example, in a speaking event or a pitch, project things which I agree with, because I couldn't bear sharing and promoting something which I didn't think was a net good relative to the other options. Or actually the most important one, protecting loved ones before myself, to the extent to which it is possible, since I find it more productive, perhaps that's a shallow word, but more productive for one to be more accountable to oneself than another is accountable to him. Because for me to succumb to the latter would be to rob someone of their autonomy, and I couldn't bear that either. As an example, a few months ago, I was sitting in a government committee whose objective it was to develop a new regulatory framework for drones. For those of you who have not shared in the unperturbed joy of such an activity, one might deem it to be similar to being a ball in a pinball machine. That's a good analogy for it. Constantly being bounced from place to place and seemingly going nowhere, and being constantly sapped of your sanity. And in one such meeting, there was a group of about 15 public servants and holders of public office, as it tends to go, unfortunately, with bureaucracy and bureaucrats. There was a huge, overwhelming, one-sided pressure to swarm the space with red tape. This might have been for a few reasons. Principally, that red tape is exactly what keeps bureaucrats in business. But also on the shallow surface of it all, they might be seen as protecting the population at large from the terrors of, in this case, drones. But as a principal private mover into that market, with our startup Arda, we could have placed ourselves as an anchor for all the drone delivery operations and could have restricted market access for competition. But personally, I've always been a strong advocate of free markets to build prosperity. I think this is arguably the one single way in which one can easily build prosperity at a low cost. So I decided to speak my mind on what I truly believed. And that was that despite the risks of drones, in this case, which, although they exist, the risks of drones, that is, not the drones themselves, they're very slim due to the development of the technology on the global scale and the global market. But the benefits they could bring, for example, in transforming a dire circumstance of access to healthcare in the developing world, or better equipping farmers, or for mapping, the list goes on, it would be absurd and criminally blocking of innovations that would benefit society to really restrict the market. And so naturally, once I said this, there was some backlash. But I was able to articulate myself well and get across a rational argument that made some positive impacts and eventually was received well. We can also take this idea to what many in this audience might have experienced in the so-called culture wars as well, more seen, of course, in the West. You see, in an era of cheap virtue, I guess is the way to put it, it is more important than ever to push back against low-resolution thinking and virtue signalling, whereby we silence one another by dint of their assumed opinion or identity in speech marks, because I'm unsure as to exactly what that word means today. But lightweight debate or conversation like this doesn't get us anywhere. But performative activism, I think that's the right way to describe it, performative activism and proclaimed righteousness act as an excuse not to go through the grueling toil of obtaining true virtue, while simultaneously silencing any conversation that does not pander to this parade of blindfolded flag waving. But it's this sort of thinking that embodies the postmodernist lens of the world, which we're seeing more and more today. It follows the Marxist view that the population at large is ultimately split into groups, and the postmodernists, originally Foucault and Derrida, follow to say that what ultimately differentiates groups of people are hierarchies of power and hierarchies of oppression. You see, the trouble in all of this is once you break society down to hierarchies of groups defined by power, you not only eradicate the sovereign individual and any self-responsibility they may have, and later on I'll come to why this is so important if it doesn't seem obviously so, but you also eradicate competence. As what point is there in competence if it is only power that will improve one's standing? To get perhaps daringly specific about things, this is largely what we've been seeing, I think, in the West's war both on race and masculinity, just to take a couple of examples. There are clear and obvious disparities in the US, one can't deny that, for example, between blacks and whites. Though for many the immediate response to this is, well, that means the whites are oppressing the blacks and disparities are due to racism. We resort to calling on the unconscious power of being white, or having white privilege, or the white gaze, as Frantz Fanon would elegantly call it, as if there is another such gaze for a white. But a deeper look into the facts shows that in 2018, for example, Nigerian Americans, those who had immigrated to the US from Nigeria to differentiate them from African Americans, had a median household income of $69,000, comfortably more than the $62,000 national average, and even more so than the $45,000 for non-immigrant African Americans. A large difference there. One also realises that children of families with absent fathers, particularly common in African American families, are 5 times more likely to be poor, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in jail. To take this even further, Thomas Sowell, the esteemed economist, observed that married, dual-income black couples earn slightly more on average than their white comparables. And even on the gender issue, without getting too deep into it, because there is just so much to say given how complex and multifactorial the issue is, we can leave that for another time. The so-called gender pay gap looks at data without breaking it down at all. All I'll say for now is that if you look at the data for men and women working the same job, with the same time commitment and experience, same years of continuous service, and so on and so forth, the data tells a very different story than the gap that so many purport, and often has women out-earning men. Needless to say, at the very top level, the data is also skewed by a very small proportion of hyper-intensive workaholic men like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, etc., that have little in the way, as many will agree, and many will see, very little in the way of family and social life, and of whose existences some may say more closely represent a non-mammalian species than that of a human. But you see, the cultural point here is that in much of the conversation today, these more complex and detailed arguments are simply being blocked due to the value we've attributed to cheap, Machiavellian, ornamental virtue. And this is particularly evident at our universities, where groupthink has dulled the minds of our brightest sparks and induced them into their ever-growing parades. One quickly finds that if one isn't to conform to these low-resolution social justice-type statements and motives, that one is very quickly shunned. One might even go so far as to say to be a conservative at university is to be part of the most oppressed minority, but I see no hashtags, marches, or social media posts about those. And clearly, they haven't had to experience the utter patronising rule of a group of liberals and SJWs on a night out. Indeed, at university, these evenings are of no short supply. In conversation, I usually try to break through the ice with a jibe, often at the unknowing expense of the closest college bum in my proximity. Though what usually swiftly follows on these evenings is a lecture on how one's comments encapsulate an oppressive privilege and reinforce social undercurrents that, without direct intervention, or drive division, disparity, how evil they are. Though these days one must actually be grateful even for this, as on more than one occasion now have my comments called curtains on seemingly close but fickle friendships. To this, I usually have a few things to say. Firstly, I'm fully entitled to make laughter of any gimp who wears university apparel to a college bar. And secondly, I have a pretty stringent policy of D&I in my teasing. No one is barred. And thirdly, it's my excuse of clutching at any fun I might have in an evening that will otherwise descend into hard seltzer, Taylor Swift, and a round table on bisexual fantasy. I digress slightly, but my point is that there really is a great nobility in finding something tangible, something important, just about within one's reach and dedicating oneself to it. I think that necessarily starts at the individual level, getting yourself sorted out as an individual so you might have some sort of solid base from which to effect any sort of meaningful and sustainable change. I think it was Jordan Peterson who said that the surest way to avoid the protester types from disrupting his lectures was to organise them to occur first thing in the morning. The ability to stick to a good routine, I've discovered over the past year or so, is one of the most powerful tools we have. Very simple things, like getting up at roughly the same time each day. Best for that to be in the morning. Stick to regular eating patterns, set aside time for concentrated work, get fresh air exposure and some exercise every day. Even if it's only for half an hour, these are the things that can build one's personal order. These are the things that do build one's personal order. They give you the sort of solid foundations from which you can build. And it's a necessity, I would say, in being successful. Not that every person who has a good routine is successful, but every successful person has a good routine. It serves as a type of stability, type of truth in one's life. And there's something I think that runs tangent to this too, and that's doing what you know of as true and right. Again, not in some abstract way, but taking the time to reflect seriously on what is important in life. And I really mean that, thinking about what's genuinely important. For me, that's reducing suffering, as a lot of the people I closely follow suggest that as well. And that can be done in many ways. For me personally, that defines my attitude to personal relationships, but also defines my work. In my startup, for example, we're actively trying to overcome the challenges of last mile delivery, looking firstly at access to critical medical supplies. In this podcast and in my writing, I try to offer comment and my vision on the world as I see it, hoping that through tussling with it, you might be able to yourself glean something useful to you. I've also found that if you take this idea of sticking to what you know is right, you meet the need for sacrifice and to have restraint. But that doesn't have to be restrictive. There's a great personal liberation in discovering that one has control over one's own actions and future. And more than that, it's a necessity, again. In Jain teaching, there's an idea of ahimsa, or non-violence. Not only violence that is done to another, but also to oneself. So one asks themselves, where does this violence come from? And I believe it to be something like giving in the most animalistic sense, to that chaos that reaps, that part within all of us, and suppressing that part within us, or preventing it from taking a hold, would not hold virtue either, because the virtue is in the very act of restraining from something that is there, combined with the fact that one may integrate that dangerous part within them in incredibly good and productive ways, such as one's ability to articulate themselves, or to hold oneself together in the face of true evils. That's true, good, integrated danger. But once you let that chaos run free and unconstrained, one is no longer in a transcendent state. That state of being that lets parts of the soul die in favour of new, reborn ones. To say this more plainly, letting the danger and chaos within us run free and unconstrained prevents one's ability to incrementally improve different parts of oneself. And that's why I believe the unmoderated liberation that we've seen in the modern age has led to the degradation of our culture, for example. As Roger Scruton said, it's very easy to break things, but very hard to make them. Again, without getting into too much detail, we've seen that in the sexual liberation, I think, which has hurt pretty much everyone, apart from a very small proportion of males. Because again, liberation without direction or calling is flailing. And to prove the tangibility of all of this, we can just take a few examples. In marriage, one sacrifices their access to other partners. In dedicating oneself to a career, one sacrifices their ability to pursue others. In dedicating oneself to truth, one sacrifices the momentary relief lies might offer. In the day-to-day of my startup too, I'd say sticking to what I know is true and right is something indispensable. If you're doing the thing that you truly believe in, you'll have the best chance of succeeding internally or presenting yourself externally. It's that ability to stick to your guns. One time that comes to mind in which this principle really supported me was with a decision regarding an early hire at Arda. Very soon after making that hire, we were faced with a tough decision. And rather than letting that outcome be an inevitable reality just further down the road, and sort of just kicking it down the hill for later, we had to make a tough decision in the moment. And it was also in sticking to that decision that, perhaps in some selfish way, we proved to ourselves that we could take a courageous decision and be resilient. And that gave us confidence and taught us a lot of lessons. And there's a real conviction in that, I think. And for me, translating that to the individual level, being able to tell myself, hey, no matter what's happened or is happening, at least I've stuck to what I know is right, the right thing to do, and that gives me a great deal of relief and comfort. The past year or two, while they've been the most exhilarating and fulfilling of my life, have also been the toughest, without a doubt. I don't know how much detail I want to get into, but when one goes through intensely depressive periods, one is in many ways subjected to nature. For short but continuous periods of weeks last year, every day I would feel physically sick, at least a handful of times. And in between that, I would be trapped sort of unsparingly in my head. From that position, it's the easy option, and I mean that in no bad way, because in the desperation of the moment, it can often feel that any option is better than nothing. But it's the easy option to let one's soul slide away into an unconstrained chaos, that we've just talked about, or worse still, stay at home and cast hate to the outside world. There's something unavoidably tempting about that, and the mirage of momentary relief and bad pleasure, I think, as Aristotle might put it, that it offers. But as an antidote to that, though, over the past couple of years, but also through my childhood, one of the things I'm most deeply grateful for, is my experience with adventure. For me, that's often been travel abroad, but has also been adventure in the abstracted sense of the word. For example, finding meaning and trying to set up my startup. I know I keep coming back to it, but there's real meaning in that. Or in starting this podcast, working with local key stakeholders in Africa to build prosperity with ideas of free enterprise, as I said, free trade. I completely understand that overseas travel isn't viable for everyone, but even in the more abstracted sense, you learn such a great deal by going on an adventure. When you start something, you've got to quite quickly assess the environment and what's available to you, what sort of direction you might want to go in. And that doesn't have to be the end goal either. I remember when we started Arda, the vision was completely different. It was much more focused on making a concentrated impact on vaccine delivery in the Gambia. But even that was direction enough and could let us get what we needed in order to start. Company registration, initial pitch to investors, even though we didn't know exactly who they would be. But we had something. There's an important point here. An adventure is only useful, for example, in finding oneself, as many like to say, if it has some ambition, or some structure or plan, some sacrifice or restraint. Treading water in the middle of an ocean is no adventure when you set out to sea, either voluntarily, or if you're pushed out there involuntarily, or if something is calling you. You have to get a plan together, otherwise you'll end up in no man's land. You have to start by getting the very first tangible things you can in order, and then giving yourself some sort of direction, and you always have to stay diligent. It's better to be battered and bruised, and be stronger for that, than to lose yourself completely. And that's where you'll discover something. Between the harmony and the disharmony, between the shadows and light, if you will. Again, to make all of this more explicitly practical, I know I've been speaking in metaphors for the past minute or so. I've seen these ideas really come to the fore in observing people's work practices, of people who I work with directly, but also those who I'm observing from a slight distance. For most people who I've observed that usually work at a relatively high or particularly committed, let's say, intensity, there's usually a couple of ways they go about this. Either one, a work hard, play hard sort of attitude that usually involves living for the weekend, as is usually said, or something like that. Or the other, which doesn't have what most would call a work-life balance, but rather the two are integrated. And I think there the thrill of play comes in the very act of working and finding continuous joy that works and integrates through the rest of your life. It's more of a pendulum, a balancing act. But more than that, I think it does a few things. Firstly, a less important point, relatively speaking, perhaps. But it means people who you work with can rely on you to be switched on and responsible to the extent to which it is possible. Certainly in some lines of work, for example, being an executive, this is a necessity to working in a committed way. But secondly, I think a lot of people live in a way that's sort of always becoming. I'll try to unpack that a little bit, because I know that sounds a little bit abstract. Listening to people like Andrew Huberman, and from my own experiences. For example, starting a meditation practice over the past couple of months, I've come to believe that genuine pleasure is found in the act of doing, not in the act of working towards something for the sake of working towards something. Not telling yourself that I will only be happy once I achieve this, or when the clock strikes 5, or I'll only be happy when Friday night hits. Firstly, that sort of skews your reward system into only doing work for the expectation that there will be some sort of dopamine spike at the end of it. But it also begs the question, what the hell are you going to do once you achieve the thing you want to achieve? There's nothing left to do because you are constantly building up to this pinnacle, and now you've reached it, you're lost. Many celebrities have talked about this, actually, and often in really serious situations. The one that immediately comes to mind is Tyson Fury talking about how he completely lost himself once he became heavyweight champion of the world, and that was the start of his spiral into depression. I want to bring the theme of responsibility into this conversation a bit more. As people in the UK might have observed even more vividly than most over the past few months. And actually, indeed, all of us might have experienced it or observed it over the COVID pandemic. There's been an ever-increasing dependency on the government on the part of individuals. I'd proffer this is largely due to the government's unconstrained growth over the past few decades. A recent report in the Times UK found that over half of the UK population, 36 million adults, that is, are now classified as being dependent on the state in the technical form of the word. 36 million adults, 36 million, who now are taking more in government spending than they are paying in tax. Both economically and otherwise, I think this is fatal. The ever-expanding and far-reaching welfare state is, of course, the biggest part of this. I'll discuss a few economic aspects in just a moment, but from the standpoint of the individual, what the welfare state does is take responsibility away from that individual. I'll be clear in saying I think there should be some form of safety net. I think that's a sensible thing to do for those at the lowest rung or rungs of society who simply can't help themselves. I would suggest a negative income tax. But I'm also equally clearly stating the welfare state is simply too big, and quite frankly has been for decades. In the US, for example, since the creation of the Great Society in the 60s, in many cases, the welfare state has removed the incentive to even disincentivize people to move up the job ladder, has disincentivized people from owning their own property, has created depleted public and newly nationalized services, removed the free market, which lets people's demands automatically assimilate into the price market, and rather replace that by a focus that tends to whatever the hot political topic is of the day. It's created vast waves of unemployment, for example, with the minimum wage law. It's ripped apart families with the subsidization of single motherhood. In the US, for example, this has meant non-marital birth rates jumping from 5% in 1960 to 40% today. This has disproportionately, as you might expect, impacted low-income people, including ethnic minorities. In fact, coming to think of it, the welfare state is very much like a toxic ex. You're slowly but surely crumbling, though being constantly told how much you need your partner, such that you can't seem to get enough. You're cripplingly attached and just not able to let go. And today, we simply can't live without Big Brother. Look at the strikes in the UK, for example. Part of me doesn't blame them, as without a competitive market, there is no natural level for wages to tend to. And by dint of being nationalised services, pay is subject to how much the government of the day wants to invest in it, relative to the other areas of government spending. But one can't help but look at the state of Mick Lynch. It's really his wife who I feel for, though. Imagine the utter melodrama when the light bulb needs changing. But anyway, beyond the bulletproof economic realities that can be used to push back against this strike action, I think there's an insight to a broader societal truth there. More and more we're seeing a society in which people constantly demand for everything to align for them, instead of first looking within and seeing what one might be able to fix. Instead of this, the first instinct is actually to victimize oneself, blame others for their oppressive power. I actually think there's a great deal of relief and sovereignty in actually being able to say, things aren't going well in my life, how am I going to turn that around for myself? Let me put it another way. I'll speak for myself. When I'm down and out, I'd much rather realise that there are parts of me that need to die and which need improving, even transforming, which I can take account for by myself. The worst thing you could say is, you're fine, just how you are, there's nothing you need to change, but rather society needs to change for you. With that comes a feeling of just being helplessly entrapped in an inability to transcend one's momentary predicament. In many of the day's social issues, race, gender, sexuality, trans, I also notice a great narcissism and rotten pride that plays off people's vulnerabilities and forces people to bow down subserviently to the self-proclaimed marginalised or oppressed. Of course, real oppression does occur in the world, and indeed the West. But here I speak more to the mainstream rhetoric we're seeing and hearing on these issues in the West. And language has been a great tool here. We're forming a newspeak, language being used as a tool to silence, with blanketing, excessively liberal uses of racism, sexism, classism, ableism, and so on and so forth. The best solution to this, though, and the necessary solution to this, is to equip oneself with the art, elegance, danger even, of articulation, and call out the misuse and weaponisation of language and push back. But further to this even, we're seeing the policing of language and the reformation of it. No longer can we say disabled people, but are conformed into saying people who live with disability. The same mutation for obese people to people who live with obesity. The word for African Americans or blacks, I don't know which one it is today, changes as often as the pronouns of a slightly bohemian Ivy League student. I was called out on using the word Oriental the other day. Kosher is off limits. Triggering is out. Ballsy. Expectant mother. A mass exodus, really. I can't help but feel this is all one big farce to make every last one of us speak and write as dully and uninspiringly as the so-called progressives. Even if nothing else could be said, at least it could be agreed that Marx, Engels, Fanon, Foucault, even, were handy litterateurs. Despairingly, their modern-day counterparts have even managed to leave this in their wake. If nothing else, I was at least able to be vexed by the Communist Manifesto. Michael Moore, Ibram X. Kendi, and AOC leave my soul as lively as that of a festering geriatric. We've seen the same thing happen in art, though I'll refrain from discussing this now, as I'll come on to it in my bonus audio essay on postmodernism, available on Spotify. But the final thing I want to talk about before doing this, though, is a degradation of conversation, which follows both language and art to the dumpster. Since founding my startup, I've had the privilege of speaking to a great deal of tech bros, as they're called. A few weeks ago I had the particular privilege of speaking, if one could even call it that, one such person on Zoom. Upon joining the call, I was promptly greeted with, "You've clearly taken the time out of your busy day to be here for a reason, so what can I do for you?" Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of getting to the point, but that verged heavily on something which I probably can't say on here. Conversation, just as good writing, art, music, should be a portal. Again, within reason, such that it isn't getting merely lost in one's ramblings. But conversation should offer openings. By allowing this, conversation can be what it should be, a place to let ideas die and new ones be born, to reveal themselves from behind the veil. Just as we've discussed in other aspects earlier on, to pull down one's speech to purely material form is to simultaneously do the same to one's soul, as the two are inseparably tied. We're confined to a rotting monotony, going mad within our own craven walls. Anyway, thank you for listening. I highly recommend you follow up on this episode by listening to the audio essay I've uploaded not on YouTube but on all other podcast platforms. It ties together a lot of the themes that I've discussed today and brings them together in a more stylized way. So again, highly recommend you listen to that. But otherwise, thank you for listening and speak soon.